Hi, this is Dr. Rosario, and this is the first lecture out of Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, we are going to be covering cellular respiration. Now, when you hear those words, I don't want you to get anxious. Students worry about this particular chapter and the next one because we're talking about a lot of different chemical reactions, those that occur in cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There's a lot of different pathways. It can get confusing. But I want you to focus on the underlying principles behind these two biochemical pathways, okay? We're not going to get really deep down into the details. That's going to be more something that you'll cover in a biochemistry class, but I really want you to focus on some core principles. With that in mind, I need to lay the framework for your understanding of cellular respiration, and that's what we're going to be doing in this lecture. We're going to focus in on what is a redox reaction. So I'm going to define that for you. I'm going to define the terms oxidation and reduction, and I'm going to put that into the context of the oxidation of glucose, which is at the center of our catabolic pathways. Hopefully, by the end of this brief lecture, you can see kind of where we're headed in terms of cellular respiration. Okay, you're going to get some of the core concepts, and then we'll get into the details in the next several lectures of each of the steps of the process. So, all energy for life essentially comes from the sun. Right? Sunlight energy is captured by our photosynthetic organisms, right? That kinetic energy of light is converted into chemical energy in the form of organic molecules. And we're going to talk about that process when we get into Chapter 10. So your different photosynthetic organisms, they capture sunlight energy and store it in these organic molecules. Now that energy is a form of chemical potential energy. Living things can capture that chemical potential energy and release that energy to perform cellular work by performing cellular respiration. This primarily, of course, is going to occur via the mitochondria. In cellular respiration, what we do is we take that energy that's stored in those organic molecules and we convert it to ATP. The ATP, in turn, powers our cellular work. I like to use this analogy of a power plant, right? So coal is a type of fossil fuel that is used to generate electricity for our appliances in our homes, right? We have a coal-fired power plant in East Orlando. Just like a power plant takes that energy and converts it from one form to another, we do the same thing in our own cells. We take the food that we eat, our carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and we use some of that food for energy. And we take them and we break them down, and then we convert the chemical energy in those molecules to ATP, the energy currency of the cell, and then we can use that ATP to perform cellular work. Okay, so cellular respiration, right? It is defined as the complete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide, right? Let's look at that chemical formula and then we'll talk about what we mean by oxidation. So the chemical equation looks like this. Glucose, which is C6H12O6, is going to be reacted with oxygen, right? And then the products of that reaction are that we are going to get carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And that energy is going to come in a couple of different forms. One is that energy currency of the cell, that usable energy, and then some of that energy is going to be released as heat, that what we consider non-usable energy by the cell. The delta G for this reaction is negative 686 kilocalories per mole. That's a lot of energy for this reaction, right? It's a highly exergonic reaction. Think about the delta G for the hydrolysis of ATP. That's about 7 kilocalories per mole. So this is a very energetic, very exergonic reaction. And we're going to capture some of that energy, not all of it, to make ATP. Okay, so let's talk about what we mean by oxidation and reduction. So a redox reaction involves the movement of electrons from one molecule or atom to another molecule or atom. So here in this particular reaction, I have two reactants. I have reactant X and reactant Y. And you can see the electron that's going to move is drawn in there for you. Now, Y here is going to gain an electron. As it gains that electron, you can see the E moves over to the Y. It becomes reduced. It becomes more negative. X becomes oxidized, right? It loses an electron. So a redox reaction involves the movement of electrons, right? The item that becomes oxidized, it loses potential energy. It loses electrons because energy is carried with those electrons. And then the item that becomes reduced gains potential energy and gains electrons. The molecule that is going to become oxidized, we call that the reducing agent because it's the electron donor. And the molecule that becomes oxidized is called the oxidizing agent because it's going to remove electrons from something. Now, to remember all of this, I have a mnemonic that I use. Leo the lion says grr. Losing electrons is oxidation. Gaining electrons is reduction. Okay? And remember, when we become reduced, we're gaining electrons. Those electrons have negative charge, right? That's where that term reduction comes from. So we've already talked about one redox reaction that's very common, which is the reaction between sodium and chlorine, right? Remember, we talked about this in the context of our ionic bond formation. Sodium has one electron in its valence shell. Chlorine has 7 electrons in its valence shell, and it's very convenient for these two atoms to interact with one another and for chlorine to strip that electron from the sodium, right? So in this example, sodium becomes oxidized, it becomes positively charged, and chlorine becomes negatively charged, right? It is reduced. Now, it does not always mean that you have the complete removal of electrons, but sometimes it means that the distribution of electrons becomes different. So take, for example, methane. Methane is CH4, and you can see the electrons are evenly distributed around the carbon atom in methane. Oxygen, molecular oxygen, is O2. And again, the electrons are equally shared between the two oxygen atoms. As methane becomes oxidized to carbon dioxide, now in that molecule, the carbon atom has to share electrons with the oxygen, and the electrons are going to be pulled towards the oxygen, right? In the same way, the oxygen, as it becomes water, right, we're moving those hydrogen atoms around, the hydrogens are less electronegative, so the oxygen pulls the electrons towards it. So it's becoming reduced, right? So these are examples of where you have redox occurring where it's not the complete movement of electrons. We're not getting charged, but we're now becoming polar, right? So in our reduction and oxidation that happens in cellular respiration, we have the oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide, and we have the reduction of oxygen to form water. In the process, this is a highly exergonic reaction. We're going to release energy. Okay, so when we move electrons around, they don't always directly transfer from one molecule to the next. Oftentimes, we have what are called electron carrier molecules that act as shuttles within the cell to carry electrons from one place to another. So what you can see here is we have three different electron carriers that we will see in the next two chapters. NAD and FAD are both involved in cellular respiration, and then NADP is found in photosynthesis. So the electron carriers, they have an oxidized form and a reduced form. In their oxidized form, NAD and NADP have a positive charge. FAD is not charged, but in all three of those cases, you'll notice that as those molecules become reduced, they gain hydrogen, right? So you can see that when NAD is carrying electrons, it is also carrying a hydrogen atom. It becomes NADH. So we say that NAD is the oxidized form and NADH is the reduced form. Same thing with FAD. FAD is the oxidized form. FADH2 is the reduced form. Okay, so we've established what oxidation and reduction are, but how do we capture the energy of oxidation? So here's a great example of oxidation in action. We have this chemical reaction where we take hydrogen gas and we react it with oxygen gas. That forms water, and it's a highly exergonic reaction in which we use it to power the shuttle, to get the shuttle into space, right? There's a ton of energy that is released in that oxidation reaction. Now, releasing the energy of oxidation in a single step is useful for launching a space shuttle into space. It's not particularly useful to a cell. In order to convert that energy into a useful form, into ATP, the cell performs oxidation reactions in a series of steps where we take that molecule of glucose and we systematically, one by one, pull the electrons off the molecule. When we do so, we also pull off hydrogen atoms, and those electrons and hydrogen atoms are carried by our electron carrier molecules, our NAD and FAD, to an electron transport chain. That electron transport chain, in turn, captures some of the energy of the electrons and then eventually transfers those electrons to oxygen to form water. So in order to capture the energy from organic molecules and convert it into a useful form, we need to make ATP. Now, the process of making ATP, we take ADP, we add a phosphate group, right? And then we get ATP, right? This entire process is called phosphorylation, right? So we're phosphorylating ADP. We're adding a phosphate group to the ADP. There's two different types of phosphorylation that occur within the cell. The first type is called oxidative phosphorylation, and the key here is that we're going to capture the energy of high energy electrons and pass those electrons through an electron transport chain to then generate ATP. So the thing you have to look out for here is oxidative phosphorylation involves the use of an electron transport chain. The other form of phosphorylation that occurs within our cells is substrate level phosphorylation. In this process, the phosphate group is attached to an organic molecule and it's directly transferred to ADP to make ATP. Right? So that organic molecule is our substrate. So here this is a direct transfer of a phosphate and it's going to involve the use of an enzyme to bring that phosphate over to ATP. So in this lecture, I defined for you what an oxidation and a reduction reaction is, I said that the oxidation of glucose is at the center of cellular respiration. And what we're doing in that process is we're releasing the energy of that molecule to then make ATP. ATP can be made using two different pathways. We can make ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, which involves the use of an electron transport chain, and then it can also be made via substrate level phosphorylation. In the next lecture, I'm going to give you an overview of the stages of cellular respiration, the different steps that are involved in the complete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide.